The Romantic Period by Emily, Mason, Brooke, and Mark.
The Romanticism period started in 1770 and lasted until the late 1870s. The Romanticism movement was a major time in imagination and thinking outside the box. It was not only a major movement for literature, but also art and music. There were four major characteristics of the Romanticism period: nature, imagination, individuality, and the everyday and the exotic. Some of the major authors of this time period were Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Walt Whitman.
Chapter 1, Nathaniel Hawthorne.
One of the most influential writers of the Romantic period was Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne was a native of Salem, Massachusetts, who lived from 1804 to 1864. Over the course of his 60-year existence, he composed several impactful pieces of literature.
Chapter 2, Edgar Allan Poe.
Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts, and died on October 7, 1849. During his life, he accomplished many things. When he was 6, he attended a school in England for 5 years, and when he became old enough, he joined the army. After he finished in the army, he resided in New York City, where he began to write. In 1845, he wrote The Raven, which can be considered one of his most influential works. The reason The Raven is one of his major works is because it is relatable to just about everyone. The death of a loved one. He writes with a more Gothic style and gives a dark and mysterious spin on his stories.
Chapter 3, Walt Whitman.
Walt Whitman wore many hats in his lifetime, including printer, school teacher, reporter, journalist, editor, clerk, office boy, and volunteer nurse. Perhaps the most important hat that he wore was as a writer. Whitman was most known as a poet. Whitman was born in May 1819 in West Hills, New York, and died in March of 1892 in Camden, New Jersey. His most influential work is made up of 12 unnamed poems that Whitman himself published in 1855, called Leaves of Grass. Whitman received very little education, so he mostly was self-taught. When Whitman published Leaves of Grass, there wasn't that much publicity or attention to it. However, throughout his lifetime, Whitman published several different versions of Leaves of Grass. Each new edition had new poems, stories, and letters from other big names in the business. When his last edition was published, there was some controversy over it being published, which caused the commotion needed to help Whitman out financially. Leaves of Grass was one of Whitman's most influential works because he didn't use a lot of poetic norms. He used first-person point of view as to be talking directly to the reader in person, and he didn't use a rigid meter in the lines of poetry. Whitman still, to this day, is considered one of America's most influential poets, along with Emily Dickinson.
Chapter 4, Emily Dickinson.
Emily Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts in 1830 and died there in 1886. She attended Amherst Academy and Mount Holyoke Female Seminary for a short time. She dropped out of school as a teenager due to chronic illnesses and depression. She became a recluse and had very few friends. Family friend Benjamin Franklin Newton introduced her to William Wordsworth's poetry. She was also very productive at writing poetry since she never left her home. She also studied botany and had an herbarium. Having never married, she just died from kidney disease at the age of 56. The homestead where she lived is now a museum. The few pieces that were published at the time of her death were altered to adhere to the conventional standards of the time. After she died, her sister discovered hundreds of the poems in notebooks that she had filled over the years. The first volume of these poems were published in 1890, with more volumes to follow. The Poems of Emily Dickinson, a full compilation, was not published until 1955. She is known for her poignant and compressed verse. This profoundly impacted the direction of 20th century poetry. Her literary voice and reclusive, eccentric life contributes to the sense of Emily Dickinson as an indelible American character.
Chapter 5, The Characteristics of the Romanticism Period. Individualism.
The Romantic period was very big for individualism because before this, no one saw a need to discover their own identities. The changing economy made individualism seem more appealing.
Nature.
Artists and philosophers of the Romantic period emphasized the glory and beauty of nature and the power of the natural world. Some scholars of Romanticism believe that the Romantics treated nature in an almost religious way. The Industrial Revolution and the timing of large areas of wilderness in Europe and North America are listed as reasons for the strong connection between nature and Romanticism. Backlash against the scientific emphasis of Enlightenment philosophy is also listed as a connection. Many Romantic artists, writers, and philosophers believe the natural world as a source of healthy emotions and ideas. Henry Davis Thoreau and other Romanticists believe humans were meant to live in the natural world of nature rather than the urban world. In contrast, the emerging urban world was often viewed as a source of unhealthy emotions, morals, and thoughts. The idealization of folk cultures and customs strengthened the connection between nature and Romanticism. Spontaneity and improvisation in art, music, and literature became widely acceptable. The oneness of humanity with nature was heavily emphasized. Natural imagery was heavily relied on by writers and artists of the time period.
Imagination.
Imagination. Starting in the 16th and 17th century, imagination was seen as stupid and trivial woman's activity. However, in the late 1770s to the late 1870s, imagination was elevated from a trivial, stupid position to a position of supreme faculty of the mind, meaning that reason and logic were no longer the most important way of thinking. Imagination was. Romantic poets alluded to the idea that imagination was necessary for one to be happy. Imagination not only was creative and fun, but also helped people to better understand things that maybe weren't so understandable. Imagination may have been the reason for the big boom and rising in artists, not only in art, but also in music.
Everyday and exotic.
The Romantic view of the world was very intricate. While it was primarily centered around emotion and fantasy, elements of realism were also present. This combination of conventionality and eccentricity created a paradoxical contrast of everyday and exotic themes. Romantics were highly intrigued by said combinations. Their fascination was exemplified by the works of literature that emphasized the contrast. The paradoxical combination of everyday and exotic was typified by authors such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, who bisected their efforts into two distinct areas, natural and supernatural, when they composed the lyrical ballads. The way such contradictory ideals converged was a definitive characteristic of the time. It shows that the Romantic period was more than simply a time of fairy tale style fantasies, but rather a period of blurred lines between fantasy and reality.